and I think basically everyone is here. Okay. Well, hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm going to take a picture of y'all.
Okay. Welcome to our July Pulpwood Queen meeting. I'd like once again to thank Jonathan and the Pat Conroy Center for hosting our meeting on Zoom. It is so, Jonathan, we really appreciate this. Our August meeting will be held on August 18th at 6 p.m. and the book is Little T by Claire Fullerton. And Claire will be joining us next month. Nice. Yes. And again, I'm going to mention this. In our club, all opinions and questions are valued. And some of you may be timid. Some of you may not be so timid. But please, those of you who are timid, become more involved. Those who are not. And please share time with everyone. Now, I would like to talk to you about Judy Christie. Judy has 18 books published, including 3 Southern small town series and her Hurry Less, Worry Less series on how to slow down and enjoy life more. An award-winning newspaper reporter and editor for 25 years, Judy co-authored the upcoming Before and After, Real Life Stories of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, which we'll be discussing tonight, interviewing adoptees who survived the orphanage that operated nefariously from 1925. Co-author on the grant releases longtime writer friend Lisa Wingate, author of Before We Were Yours, international best-selling novel about the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Judy's married to a retired teacher and lives in rural Colorado. Another adventure that inspires her writing projects. Hello, Judy, and welcome.
Hey, y'all. How you doing? So I'm trying. Thanks for having me for the introduction. Jonathan, thanks for being so organized on Zoom. Somebody asked about seeing everybody. You can hit gallery, right, Jonathan? And you'll. Correct. I'm looking at all of you except Lydia and Mary have your just your, I guess your audio. Well, maybe not even your audio on, but your names are up. So that way I can kind of see y'all. Thank you so much. I tell you, I don't think I hardly knew what Zoom was. Probably about a year ago, a client of mine started using it. And all of a sudden, you know, everybody's Zooming. My little great niece in Dallas, her dad's working from home. He's a chief financial officer for a business in Dallas. And she came to his office and said, could you help me with this? And he said, go ask your mother, which I just read a New York Times story, is pretty common. And she said, and her mother's a teacher. And this little 2-year-old said, Mommy Zoom, Mommy Zoom. So we're all I just always say Judy Zoom now. And thank you so much. I'm really excited. Well, I'm excited to be with a group of Pulpwood Queens for one thing. I've been a member of a Pulpwood Queens chapter for many years, and I've participated in Girlfriend's Weekend. I saw Jonathan there. I've had such a good time, and some of you I know have been there, and you know how much fun it is. The best thing to me about Pulpwood Queens, whether you're meeting in Jefferson with Kathy or whether you're meeting in your chapter, is how readers and writers really come together. And to me, that there's a special kind of magic to that. And so I really am so thankful to be with you. Now, this book, Before and After, that I appreciate y'all reading it. It really is, in a weird way, a baby of Pulpwood Queens, because I met Lisa Wingate through Kathy many years ago, more than a decade ago, in Jefferson, Texas, and we were writing buddies. And when Lisa's book, Before We Were Yours, which I tried to position back there on the back, you know, in some artsy way like they do on MSNBC. But anyway, when Before We Were Yours came out, then the opportunity to work with Lisa came along on Before and After. So it all kind of leads back to Kathy. I always tell folks that all roads lead in reading and writing lead to Kathy Murphy. So I want to talk about Before and After, and I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. To me, Before and After is the most meaningful professional project I've ever worked on, because it is an example of how stories really, really change lives. And so a couple of things happened in this writing process. One was, as these adoptees and their families, there were 15 families profiled in Before and After, as you may know. As they talked about their stories, they really healed. That, I know of no other word for it. They will call me, they will email me, and we've been together as a group multiple times. And it really heals us to tell our stories. And so that, to me, is one thing that's really important about Before and After. Another is that, and a reminder of how stories touch people in different ways at different times. And Jonathan, I know you work with books all the time, and surely you see this where a book that you hadn't thought about in years is out there, and somebody mentions how it touched their lives. And I got an long email yesterday from a woman in Memphis who said, my father was a Georgia Tan baby. And because of reading Before and After, I really am going to get more dedicated to finding out more about his birth family. It was always sort of a no-no in his family to talk about his adoption. So I was able to put her in touch with the woman Jamie, who's in Before and After, who is now helping other adoptees find their birth families, other of the Tennessee Children's Home Society adoptees. So to me, that's like one of the great things about writing this book. Another one is that, you know, a weird thing happens, like this book is really a nonfiction sequel to a novel. And I don't know of any other, and some of you may be able to think of one. I can't think of another novel that spawned a nonfiction book. I can think of nonfiction books that led to novels. And I'm just curious, have all of you read Before We Were Yours? Would you raise your hand? Because I can actually see you, except for Lydia there. Yeah, so most of you have read it. Well, you know, it was the strangest thing. And I love this thing that Lisa Wingate says, that she said, you know, this is, Before We Were Yours is Lisa's 30th book, by the way. So she's had a few tries at it, and she really found the right topic and told it beautifully. And so she's had this amazing bestseller. And one of the things she says about it is, you write these fictional characters and they come back to you, and they have real people by the hand. And that is so true. I see that sometimes in my other novel, some novels I've written, where somebody will say, oh, that reminded me so much of my mother. And it's really interesting how a book can touch somebody. But this, Before We Were Yours, touched a chord in a really unique and unexpected way. So these people who had been either adopted or family members had been adopted through that whole Georgia Tan awful situation from 1924 to 1950, they started contacting Lisa. Sometimes they would show up at book clubs, sometimes they would email her, and they said, well, that's so much like my story. Can you tell me more? Can you help me? And they wanted to get together, which I think is pretty interesting. I used to call it a reunion, and then I got to thinking, well, they had never been together in the first place, but they had a real need to come together. So these folks, they said to Lisa, could we do this? So Lisa calls me. We're both very type A people, so we'd get together about once every month or two and talk on the phone, always at lunch, so that we're not wasting our time, allegedly. Although during the pandemic, I welcome a call anytime, you know, just ring phone. But so Lisa and I were talking, having our regular working lunch. I was working on a screenplay at the time. She was working on another novel, but she said, well, she'd been on this rigorous book tour. Some of you may have seen her and on your coast. And so she said, well, would you ever have any interest in helping me with this gathering? And I said, well, sure, you know, tell me more. Come to find out, y'all, I was talking to her in April of 2018, and she wanted to get together a big gathering in Memphis in June. I just about did a spit take. If I'd have been having that wine, I would have done a spit take. It was like, what? We can't do that, but we did it. We got together, and there were probably about 30 of us the first time, and it was such an amazing thing watching these adoptees and family members get to know each other. They were very tentative. We were a little tentative, like, what if it didn't go well? So I began to collect stories, and I'm a journalist at heart. Let's see, over my shoulder there, you can see my first newspaper, the Barrett Banner. It's that little frame thing. It was really, about this big. It was really printed on a real press, though. And so I'm a journalist at heart, and I love chronicling stories. I have always thought, and I'm just going to ask each of you, if you're so inclined, keep your story, write it. Please, just, even if you only do little videos on your smartphone where you say something like that you tell your grandchild or your child, because our stories really matter. So as a journalist, I thought it was super important to record this part of history. And I need to tell you, I was embarrassed until I knew that Lisa was writing Before We Were Yours, and I read an early copy for her. It was never in my consciousness if I had heard of it. I don't think I had ever heard of Georgia Tann. Had any of you heard of Georgia Tann before We Were Yours? So I don't know about y'all, but I was a Southerner. I grew up I like to tell people I was born in LA, Lower Arkansas, but I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. I edited newspapers. I edited the newspaper in Jackson, Tennessee, y'all. I'm married to a Jackson, Tennessee native. I have a stepchild in Memphis and one in Nashville, and still I had never heard of this. I was really embarrassed. And as come to find out, it was kind of a hidden secret. It was one of those things where people didn't talk about it. Adoptees didn't know what to make of it. There was a little tint of scandal to it. And so I felt like it was really important for these people to be able to tell their story in their words. And that has really led to some kind of almost magical moments between them and healing in their own families, which they've been very generous to either call me or email me and tell me about. So that's a little bit about how it came about. I do want to say one other thing, and then maybe we'll go to some questions, and then I can talk to you some more about the behind the scenes if you'd like me to do that. I just want to say, right now we're in this most divisive time, and I honestly, it's hard for me to believe we've gotten to this point, and I think it's so important for us to read and to really appreciate stories. And I think stories bring us together. I think they help us understand other people. And I also know that even if you're reading fiction instead of nonfiction, you're still learning about other worlds. If it's done well, I would say, you're learning about different times in history. And it seems to me that stories right now might be one of the few ways that we're going to heal ourselves, to come together, is this shared sense of story and what really matters. And so anyway, having said that, you want to ask me some questions, and then maybe I will spin off some of those, and I can certainly talk more. And while we're getting to those, I did want to show you, because I'm now meeting with you from my office, which is a loft at our place where we live full-time in very rural Colorado. So I started out, and I just ordered, I love these Rhodia notebooks, some of you may know them, and I just started interviewing people. Even before we got together in Memphis, I flew down to Florida, I flew to Atlanta really quickly to see. We weren't sure if this would be an oral history, we weren't sure if it would be a magazine article, but it turned out to be a book, and Random House was great, to buy it and publish it. So these are the examples of my notes, and I tag everything, and I put everybody. I write everything. I like my computer, obviously, but I have kept a journal since I was 11, and I still have all of them. You can see some of them behind me. Those are the ones I call my big picture journal, where I sort of, if I get an idea for a novel, or even doing this book before and after, where I take notes. It's also where I plan out things like things I want to do in a given year and that sort of thing, fun things I want to do in a given year. So I like writing things down, and so I just took tons of notes. I did record a lot of the people just so I would have it, but I mostly just wrote off of my notes in these notebooks. So that was really a good way to kind of collect it. And I also was so fortunate that there's a lot of primary material left. And I was surprised, frankly. A lot of it was destroyed when Georgia Tan was outed and then died. But it's great. Like I have in my office, a lot of these people were so generous to send me. Some of them sent me original stuff, but letters that their mother had written Georgia Tan. And here's one. I'll cover this. But so this is a letter that Georgia Tan wrote to a mom, and she always put on her letterhead. This creeps me out, but like all these happy, perfect families, somebody's doing ballet, and she was really insidious, but she would just make up stories and write in these letters. So I have a lot of those, that sort of thing. Anyway, questions? Oh yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself, by the way.
Unmute. Okay. Colleen?
There you go. Colleen?
You need to unmute yourself.
I think Colleen might have her tape over her camera like I often do on mine.
No, I don't. It was fine. I don't know what happened. I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know what happened to it.
I was saying I put a piece of tape on mine, and it usually looks about like that if I forget to take it off.
I was perfect just a second ago.
Do you have a question, Colleen?
No, I was just trying to get this to work.
Okay. Does anyone have a question? Oh, Dana, go ahead.
With all of the amount of research that you did, it had to just be tons and tons and tons. How did you decide what you would put in the book? Did everything go in, or was there a lot of cases that didn't make the book? How did you go through all your research?
That's a great question, Dana. So as luck or divine intervention would have it, Lisa Wingate and her husband had already planned to come spend a week in we have a little guest suite in our basement. It's a walkout basement. And so they were going to actually be up here in Colorado trying to escape Texas heat. This was 2 summers ago. And so we would come up here, this very room where I'm sitting, and we just began to almost like you would plot a novel if you were trying to kind of figure out the 3-act structure in a novel. And we got these Dollar Tree science fair boards. Don't ever pay $15 at like Staples, because you can get them for $1 at Dollar Tree. But anyway, and we just put sticky notes on those, and we began to look at what we had. So we looked at we wanted examples of the different ways that Georgia Tan operated and the horrible things she did, but we also wanted the life-affirming outcomes. And when we began to look, weirdly, we had a nice collection of different kinds of stories. So we had the person who was stolen from the front yard she was a twin. She was about 8 years old. She and her twin, they told her new parents she was 6. And so, we had her and her 4 daughters. We had one of Georgia Tan's methods, method of operation, was she liked to place Jewish babies because she could make a lot of money. It was very hard after the Holocaust and with anti-Semitism for Jewish families to adopt babies. Isn't that something that's things you I never really thought of that until I researched this book. And so Georgia Tan would take these basically rural Southern Baptists, and she would make up these incredible stories about them. And they became Jewish babies whose mothers were, young and beautiful and killed in a car wreck, and whose father was a medical student, and whose grandparents owned a haberdashery shop in Nashville and just couldn't take care of this infant. Well, this baby was not Jewish in any way. Now she's 77. She was reared Jewish. She still practiced the Jewish faith. Her grandchildren, her whole family is Jewish, and it's so fascinating. So that's kind of how we did it. Somebody's not muted, and they've got something happening, Jonathan.
I'm not sure who's not muted.
I'm not
Somebody's
sure.
dog, I think, is there back there. So anyway, so what we did was we looked at the list of people we had, and they fit really well. Another thing was we made a decision early on. We would twist no one's arm to be profiled for the book. These are older people. They have already had this traumatic experience in their life. We wanted to share their stories. And we only had a couple of people who said, no, that's not for me. So we immediately ruled those out. And a funny thing happened along the way, though. It's like people would pop up and say maybe they were a little skeptical about talking, but then as we got to know each other, they very much wanted to talk. So that was really special. Now, the bigger issue to me is since the book is released, which was last fall, we hear from a lot of people, as I was saying earlier, and there are people who would really like to tell their story and have it preserved. And I haven't really gotten a good way of doing that. I have taken a lot of notes, and like I told you, we've connected them with some of the other adoptees, but I don't see there being another book of the Georgia Tan babies, but I would like there to be some sort of record of their lives. I've heard from just amazing people since the book came out. So there's a woman in Jackson, Tennessee, ironically enough, where my husband's from, and she got in touch with me, and she said so the people that I spoke with, you got to remember this happened from 1924 to 1950. So the youngest adoptee I spoke with was she actually was one of the very last Georgia Tan babies. So she was 69, and the oldest that I spoke with had been adopted by a Tennessee legislator and his wife, and she was 85, I believe, at the time I talked to her. She is in a long-term care facility in Middle Tennessee. And so I had this span of people. Well, this woman gets in touch with me pretty soon after the book comes out, and she's just about in tears. And she said, I am a Georgia Tan baby. She was 86 when I spoke with her back in the fall. She said, I just read this book. It had such an impact on me because I've never found my birth family, but I've always wanted to find, my mother, know who my mother was. Obviously, her mother it'd be unlikely she'd still be living. And since that, she wrote me just this beautiful, she's 86, this beautiful email about how reading before and after it really healed her, how she realized there were other people like her. She's found 2 half-sisters so now she's 86. Just think, our whole lives we long for these answers to questions. That's, one thing I found in the book. So, Dana, that's kind of how we did it. We wanted to make sure we had like the child of a movie star, and we chose Smiley Burnett's son, who I found living weirdly in West Tennessee, not far from where my in-laws lived, and he had been in the movie business himself. We wanted to make sure we had the Jewish story told, and it wasn't like we were turning down people. I take that back. There was another person who contacted Lisa, and then I spoke with him, and he had a little bit of notoriety nationally in the entertainment field, and he just didn't really seem logical in his thinking. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, he just seemed a little confused. So we didn't pursue that. I mean, we tried to be super fair. I was a journalist. I never really liked gotcha journalism. I learned a term early on. I was a newspaper reporter and an editor. And I learned a term early on. The term is news virgin. And that's the person you see who's out at a car wreck site and somebody thrusts a camera in their face, and that person doesn't really know how to respond. We didn't want to do any of that. And so it turned out to be like, I have now a whole group it's almost like an extended elderly family, shall I say. So I hope that answered your question. Somebody over here who's not exercising but drinking wine, I can't remember your name, has a question, I think.
You got to unmute, Ann. There you go.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Nope.
Okay.
Hey,
Yeah.
Ann.
Hi. I was just wondering, I kind of got the feel that as you went along with your interviews, you really weren't sure what was going to come next, and that was kind of intriguing the way you laid your book out, and I really enjoyed that. And I just wondered if, what was it that surprised you the most as you interviewed? Was there something that really was like, oh my gosh, I didn't expect this? Or
Yeah, that's a really good observation and question. And the one thing was we did not know what was going to happen. And when Lisa called that day and we were just chatting over lunch and then her voice shifted and she asked me about taking part in this, both of us we had some doubts. For one thing, as y'all know, there are a lot of odd people in the world, and we what if we brought these people together in Memphis and they're all older and they've all had these traumatic experiences in their lives, and what if it was awful? And that was a little scary. What if some weirdo shows up? We're having these public events in Memphis, and so we were a little concerned about that. The things that were surprising, and maybe when you look back, not so much. One is, even though people talk about, they say, oh, this was so sad, and to me, I was just really pleased with how heartwarming the stories were, mostly because these people were so resilient. They never gave up. Even the ones who had, some really strange things happen, and almost all of it had something strange happen. But yeah, so that was one thing. The thing I loved the most and that really surprised me was how hungry these people were to talk to me about their stories. And it really made me realize that we don't spend enough time, this probably sounds corny, listening to older people. We sort of blow them off, I know I've been guilty of this. My 88-year-old aunt will call me and, it's like, oh, good, I'm good. How you doing? Bye. And I listen to these people for hours. I listen to them on the phone. I listen to them in person. I called them back to verify. I researched background to double check what they were telling me, like, just to make sure they were where they said they were at certain times, because to me, those are pretty good journalistic tricks to make sure that you've really got the real deal. And I loved the way these people told their stories and the way it mattered to them. That I can just see, like, sitting in this assisted living apartment where this woman's world has shrunk down. She lived in a big home. Now everything is, she's just got this small space. She had to let her dog go live with somebody else because she couldn't take care of him, that kind of thing. And I can watch her say, I want to tell you these things. And she was 85. And so yeah, the way people told their stories. And I just think that I've always believed since my 6th grade days as a journalist that I think everybody has a story to tell. And sometimes you just have to ask the right questions to get the story. And sometimes you just have to listen and let people talk. So that to me was really something I loved. Another thing that surprised me is how most of the people, now they didn't connect just instantly. It wasn't like, yay, we're going to all be together as a family, but how most of them connected with some of their birth family in an extremely loving and close-knit way. I have 3 brothers I love. We are genetically stamped. Other than the fact that I still have my hair and I have lots of it because I hadn't been able to get a pandemic haircut. But my brothers and I are very close and we look alike. And I just think sometimes if somebody came out of the blue and said, hey, Judy, I'm your half brother. Your dad, when he was in the service, had an affair and I was sent through. How would I react? These people longed for their siblings in particular. It was almost like they had this almost this sixth sense that there was somebody out there. And I know this sounds strange, and I didn't go into this project thinking I would find this. So that was a surprise. The other thing is just a kind of a fun thing is I bet when you go, if are any of you adopted, by the way, that you would be willing to mention that? Because sometimes somebody will bring up adoption in book clubs, but if you go to so you live in the South, and if you go to a family reunion, and you'll see somebody who'll immediately go, oh, you look just like your Aunt Betty Sue, and that is something I've always taken for granted. I have my grandmother Brosie's hands. I have, you know, a lot of I have the pace nose, and most of these people, and I had never really thought of this till I did the book, spent their lives looking for somebody who looked like them. Even the people who did not really want to go very deep into their adoption story would say, well, yeah, I was in an airport. At any time I was in an airport, this one man told me, I would look for, see, could that person be related to me? I think that's pretty fascinating. I think we kind of take that connection for granted. Somebody else have a question? How are we doing? Good?
Oh.
Any other questions?
Colleen, you need to unmute yourself.
Oops.
Muted again.
There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about
That's
that.
okay.
I just wanted
It
to point
happens.
out two things that kind of amazed me, if I can remember them both now since I had to unmute. One of them was that many of the times the push to come there and the push to do it was by their children.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of made me think more, like you're saying, like listening. Like I talk to my children and grandchildren about their great grandparents, but they're probably interested in my story too. But it was like this search for knowledge about, you know, what is medically mine was coming really from their children and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was, I don't remember the woman's name, but she said that she was very, very quiet, and the fact that she was afraid to date because she might be dating her brother.
Right.
And it put it, to me, that put it this whole unknown that I didn't really think about, you know. You just think someone going through.
It really is true, Colleen. You know, I had never thought about that either. We have some adoption in our family, but not a lot. Then I have a really good friend who adopted an infant from China many years ago, and I've watched that relationship unfold. And it is, so a couple of things related to what you said. One is this story will resonate, and it's going to have ripple effects for generations, because everybody that Georgia Tan placed had a family, and now they're out there with another family, and that DNA is spread all over the country and probably the world. And so one of the strange things is that as these children and grandchildren have come along, they want medical history. So when they go in to the doctor, they say, I've never even thought about this. They said, when I'm asked to give my medical history, I have to leave it blank. And that has become, you know, such an important thing. And especially with Ancestry and 23andMe and other of those DNA services available, that has become a really big thing. And so that certainly, to me, is one reason this is going to just continue. I mean, it will not go away because the DNA is going to be out there. The other weird thing is, if you ask around there in where you live in South Carolina, you will come across somebody who is either a Georgetown baby, their mother was a Georgetown baby, their aunt was a Georgetown, because they're everywhere. And every time when Lisa and I speak, in the most random places, somebody raises their hand. You know, we were in this country club event in McKinney, Texas, back when the book launched, and a woman stands up at a very huge Friends of the Library thing and says, my husband is a Georgetown baby. You know, it's really pretty amazing to me. And I think you'd be surprised to know how many connections there are out there. Another thing about that is Georgia Tan, so conservatively speaking, she placed 5,000 of these children in this really illegal baby, you know, scheme, adoption scheme. And some people think it was more, and I've never been able to prove that. Now, one of the women who is in the book, Janie, she has her paperwork that has her number on it. Her number is like 7,000 some odd. So it would be likely that there are more than 5,000 that were originally placed. The other thing is that, you know, about 500 at least kids died in Georgia Can's care, and either from influenza or neglect, basically benign neglect. She really only liked pretty babies. If you were blonde, you were a premium. Now, if you were dark-haired and real pretty, she would place you with Jewish family in, often in New York. She placed people, of course, with a lot of movie stars and famous people in California because they had a lot of money. And yeah, so it's really kind of interesting how the ripple effect that this is having and will continue to have. And, you know, people are a little skeptical sometimes. Like, I love this adoptee. It's been really fun to watch over about a year and a half, these people sort of evolve or unfold. And so there's this guy up in Northwest Arkansas, up around Fayetteville, and he's kind of a blustery guy in his 70s. And he was like, I don't need to know anything, but my kids want to know. And he talks kind of like that. And I'm from Arkansas, so I could use that accent. And so, you know, but it's been interesting even to watch him and know that deep down, like when he proposed to his current wife, his second wife, after he got divorced and remarried, and when he proposed, he said, there's something you need to know about me. I'm adopted. You know, in case that was enough to make her want to cry off. So anyway, I don't know if that addressed your points, Colleen, but did that address both of those? Or okay, anybody else? Any up? Somebody's down. Oh, I know. It's a person who had horns on earlier on her avatar. I can't hear her though.
Yeah. Rosemary, can you
Oh,
unmute your?
Rosemary. There you.
There it is.
There you go.
Yeah.
Hey, Rosemary.
Our internet keeps going out. We're getting the fiber optic tomorrow, but
good.
Yes, but Comcast seems to have given us our last day. So, I have a question. I have a sister that gave a baby up for adoption, and I found him through 23andMe. And it was a boy. Yeah, he was born in 1974. And when I found him, my sister feels that a boy would never want that he's and I come from a very big family, and I feel like this piece is missing. So I have written to him a couple of times because you can message, but as soon as I wrote him the first time, he blocked me. But I can see him that he does come back and he looks, because you keep getting updates of more relatives that you have. And so I finally told my sister that I had been in contact with him. And first she was like, oh, why did you do that? Not very angry, but more, she's never had another child. She's not married. And this guy is it. So and I don't know, I'm kind of hopeful at some point. I'm going to keep writing him. You know, I wish him Merry Christmas and tell him that your grandmother is still alive, and there's a bunch of us. And I don't know, maybe someday, if it's not him, maybe it'll be one of his kids.
You know, that is quite possible. And I learned through this, one of the adoptees, we were all sitting around this conference room in Memphis chatting one morning, and one person said this, and it did stick with me, because I tend to be the kind that would be like, hey, come on, you sure you don't want to, join in the family kind of thing.
Right.
She said, everybody has to come to that on their own, and it is their decision to make. And it's really hard. Having said that, I missed a tiny bit of what you said because you cut out on my end, but I would say this, by and large, and this is anecdotal, the males I spoke with were less interested in digging very deep than females. And now that if you spoke with them and you really, again, let them tell their story and express their emotions and all of those things, they really did want to know. And every one of these people that I spoke with who were the adoptees, they just yearned for their birth family and that piece of them. I guess, there was just a piece missing in their lives. Some of them did not learn they were adopted until later in life, and yet they always just knew something was off. Like this one woman I just love in Nashville. She's a retired engineer and mechanical engineer, and went to Vanderbilt. And she said, I couldn't figure it out. She's the one, if you read the book, who was in a high school a biology class rather, doing a genetics exercise and realized, I can't be my parents' biological child. She became convinced they were her grandparents because almost all of these parents were older. They could not adopt conventionally. That's why they went to Georgetown and paid these exorbitant travel fees. I figured it up just the last 10 years, 1940 to 1950. In today's dollars, Georgetown made $10 million in travel fees. And, so she would say, I didn't sell the baby. I just was paying to get it there. And I have actual letters from her that went to these families that say things like, please make the check payable to Georgetown. And then on the memo line, put travel. So, I don't know. I guess I got a little bit off of your point, Rosemary. I feel for that person, though, because what I was really getting at is that he probably really does want to know. Now, there is another thing, which is a lot of people the men in particular, did not want to upset their adoptive mothers. That was just like, you did not speak of it around mama. And that letter that I got to yesterday from the woman, the long story about her dad saying the book had moved her to look for her dad. She said, my father never wanted to talk about it because he didn't want to hurt his mother. And so,
Right.
I feel for him. I've met a lot of adoptees since the book came out. People have come up to me to say, I wanted to find my mother, but I wasn't ready. Some people say they don't want to until they're 21. Some people, I started to tell you about the great guy in northern Arkansas, the insurance salesman, and he said, what if he's never looked until recently because his daughter wanted to know. And he said, what if I find out that my mother was a serial killer? And, it's kind of like, and so I'm sure there's a high level of fear. I was at a dinner party not long, well, it's been more than, I guess, 5 months ago, but I was at a dinner party. Remember those things, dinner parties, y'all, where you sat next to people and you had drinks and food. But anyway, we'll get back to that after COVID. But this woman says, oh, I'm adopted. She's in her 20s. And she said, I've just reached out and found 2 half siblings. She was extremely nervous about it. And so I was happy to say, just listen to them and give, you can't come in like with both barrels blazing. Now, I will say one other thing about this young man is, he may in time come around. So one of the women in the book, she's a retired advanced math teacher in Memphis. And she told me early on that she had contacted her sister and that a half sister through a lawyer. This is really before Ancestry and before the internet being really a good place to track people down. And she said that her sister, who was truly her birth sister, was just like, you're a damn liar. That my father never slept around. But sure enough, he did. And he was engaged to this sister's mother and married her, and then was at the same time having a fling. And so the sister was so angry, but she has slowly come around. They've gotten to be friends. They go to lunch together once a week. And when we were all together in Memphis, she was there, stood up, told her story. So I think healing happens for different people at different rates. So.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Judy, did you find, that generation in the 50s, 40s and 50s, they didn't talk about stuff. And
Right.
I'll tell you my personal experience. My mother told my sister and I that our father was killed in Korea. And so I didn't find out until I was 20 that my father wasn't my father. And a couple years ago, I'm 68. A couple years ago, I get a letter and it says, "Are you Janet, blah, blah, blah? Was your mother so-and-so?" And it turned out that I have several half-sisters
Oh,
and
wow.
45 first cousins that I
Oh
didn't
my
know.
gosh.
My father was one of 10. And so I pulled together an 800 phone call with everybody. My sister wants no part of it. I'm going out there to meet them all, but my sister wants no part of it. And it's kind of interesting though, because, and then my mother had told us that our father was killed. So we never searched or anything. We didn't even
Right.
think about it. And then they signed me on to ancestry.com with 1,800 ancestors on it. And it turned out my father died at the age of 41 of a heart attack. He was
Wow.
messing around on my mom when she was pregnant with my sister. So that's, that's kind of, and thank God I never went through anything like this story, but it was really a shock to me a couple years ago to find this out. And anyway, so I can't even imagine what it's like to have been adopted, but no, my mother would never talk about it. And I didn't know until after she had passed.
I think that generation, definitely the era that they lived in played a huge part. So for Georgia Tan, for her deeds of adoption to work, there was the Great Depression. There was the whole, just poverty in the South, particularly Tennessee and Arkansas, where a lot of these babies came from. There was then World War II, the Korean War. There was the Holocaust. A lot of things came together historically that let this happen. And a lot of people were told lies about their parents, like instead of saying, like one woman, rather, the one who was born in 1950 was told that her parents had died in a car wreck. Well, they didn't die in a car wreck, and so yes, I think the number of stories like that, especially with Ancestry and 23andMe, there are tons of those. And I think that there are probably, and I found this one thing I did, I wasn't out to like expose somebody, like you had an illegitimate child, but like, for example, one of the men I absolutely adore in this book who lives in Utah, and he was raised out in California, and he was adopted through the Movie Star Network. Like a neighbor said, "Oh, go see Georgia Tan," that thing. And it's just kind of fascinating to me how he didn't look until his daughter really wanted to look, and they started looking, and he's in not very good health, which is why this project really was urgent. Most of these people are getting older, and I know we're going to lose a lot of them in just the next few years. And so anyway, he found his daughter found for him, y'all, 2 half brothers, and like a nephew basically comes up on the DNA. Well, the nephew was the out of wedlock child of one of these men who absolutely doesn't want anybody to know and doesn't want any contact. And so my friend John, the adoptee, he's very respectful of that, but it did really hurt him because he's old and he never had any siblings, and he would love to have them. And so sometimes there is that sort of oh, don't come around here. Here's one of the oddest ones, which is in the book, and I'll kind of wrap up with this. And so one of the women who was born to an Irish Catholic, she's not profiled in the book. She was born to an Irish Catholic schoolgirl, teenager, who had a fling with a college boy, got pregnant, and went to Georgia Tan, basically one of her holding facilities. She had a whole network of these to have this baby. And And so the baby was given up as a Jewish baby, even though the mother was Irish Catholic. This woman who I know well, and so she lives down in Florida, and she was raised as the child of a Jewish rabbi. She was born to an Irish Catholic school, basically teenage girl in the South, and so she was subjected. This shows you how ridiculous prejudice is. She was subjected to anti-Semitism because she was Jewish, and they would be moved around to these assignments, these tabernacle, synagogue, temple assignments in the South. She was, people would be prejudiced against her. It's just so ridiculous. But anyway, she eventually found her birth mother, who met her briefly in a hotel in a big Midwestern city, and said, I'm married, and my husband doesn't know I ever had a baby, another child. She has 2 adopted children because she and her husband were unable to have children, and he always thought it was his wife's fault. It wasn't her fault because she had had a child once before. So anyway, these secrets they're pretty amazing. So I thank y'all so much. I know we're almost out of time. I do want to say, I guess all of y'all have read Kathy's Pulpwood Queens Celebrate 20 years. So I have an essay in here, and also I just like to put in a plug for it because it's really full of a lot of reader love, book love. And then Lisa, my dear friend and co-author, well, by the way, so Before We Were Yours has been on the New York Times list, bestseller list. Well, it's in trade paperback now, I think 53 weeks last I looked, which was last week. And of course, it was on for almost a year in hardback. And so it's really been a phenomenal book, and it's very exciting that we were able to change some lives with the follow-up. And then this is Lisa's new book, which y'all are probably aware of, which is The Book of Lost Friends.
Yeah.
And it's also, some of you read that, it's also based on a little-known piece of history, and it actually, a lot of it is taken from archives in New Orleans that a reader sent Lisa the link to and said, I think you'd be interested in this, and Lisa used it. So it's also been on the New York Times list, and it's about former slaves in Reconstruction who are desperately looking for their families, and these ads exist online. They were the ads that people put into a Methodist newspaper looking for their families. And so it's a really, and then the modern day story is a teacher who's trying to help her students learn the intersection of their personal history and their lives in the 80s, I think. So anyway, I just always like to put in a plug for that. Anything else, Shar? Have I answered y'all's questions?
I loved this discussion. It was great. It was interactive, and I just wanted to know quickly, how was it to write this book about such emotional and personal stories?
You know, it was really hard. I had been a reporter, and I'd covered a lot of really hard stories in my life. I mean, really tragic stories. And I had done a lot of investigative reporting, so I understood the research part. What got me, I'd be sitting up here in my office, and I'd be reading all these things that were called story sheets that Georgia Tan kept. I cannot really believe how many are still left, as I said earlier. And they would just say the most, you know, it would just be about, oh, this baby is so beautiful and she will be highly desired. And, you know, sometimes that stuff just was like, oh, one of the stories was a woman who had an affair with a married man. He said he was going to marry her. He didn't. And she was staying in a rooming house, which had the baby. He didn't come back after like the first 6 weeks of the man, the father. And she wanted her baby so badly, but she owed, in today's dollars, about $700 in rent, and she didn't have it. Plus, she had this bad reputation. You know, one way that life has changed is that if you have a child and you're not married, you're not an outcast, you know. I mean, in those days, you were like a pariah. It is amazing how that changed, and that goes to your point about the era. And anyway, so yeah, that really got me. the other thing was there's stories of people who just longed their whole life for these siblings. One of them's the man in Ohio who didn't want to first talk to me. He wanted his daughter to tell me his story, which as a journalist, I found that a little bit problematic, but I thought, hey, I'm going to run with it. And sure enough, you know, I got to know her, and then he talked to me. Well, he didn't even know. He's the one who he found it through DNA, and it was one of the women, one of the adoptees, who her grandson asked for a DNA, an ancestry kit, to try to see who was out there because he loved his grandmother so much. And so that story to me was one of the most poignant, where he was in his 80s. He's in his mid 80s now, not in great health. I do stay in touch with him and his wife, and he really, for him to find his family, both his wife, he's one of the few who's had a very long marriage. A lot of these have had several marriages, but he's been married to his wife for quite a long, like 55 or 60 years. And both his wife and his daughter told me that he finding his sister and then two other siblings just changed him. It eased up something that for 80 years had eaten at him. He's the one, by the way, who found out. And I will say this, if you ever have anybody in your family who adopts a child, and you can gently say, don't keep it a secret, you know, let the child know. This man he found out when he was about 15 or 16, and he was at his grandmother's funeral, and he just picked up a family Bible, and weirdly in there was a notation that he was adopted. And boy, it was not a happy moment in many ways. So yeah, it was very emotional. I hope that came across. These people, I try not to think of them as victims. I try to think of them as survivors. I really think there's a lot of heartwarming stuff. There are a lot of life lessons, and don't give up. You know, if you're trying to get a goal, like looking for, these people looked, I mean, that again, before internet, before cell phones, they were putting dimes in payphones in Memphis, and don't give up. And they really, really have a great love of family. And that's a good reminder, you know, when you get aggravated with your family.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you.
Truly enjoyed this.
Yes,
Truly
thank
enjoyed
you.
this.
Oh, thank y'all. Y'all are great. And I'll send your, now, do you care if I post it on social media? I'm going to do one more picture of all of y'all. Let's see. Is it okay if I put it on social media, or would you rather I not?
Absolutely. I hope it's
Okay.
okay because I do it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Jonathan, thank you boy, it's wonderful having Shar and Jonathan who organized this, so it all worked so well. And y'all just keep reading and hang in there. We'll get through this, right?
Right. Thank you, Judy,
yeah.
once
Okay,
again.
bye.
Thank
Good night.
you. Thank
Bye.
you.
Hey, everyone. We'll see you next